welcome everyone to is this the last of our master classes?
Penultimate
master class for this year's edition of the Bay Street Film Festival. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out to the master class, and I want to remind you that the film, you're about to see a trailer for a film. It'll be playing later today. Tomorrow.
1 o'clock, I think.
At 1 o'clock, we think. Anyhow, I should know that. I'm supposed to be the MC.
It's on the inside there.
Anyhow, it's coming up. But today's presentation, this morning's presentation, is the genealogy of genealogy. And our very special guest from York University, Toronto, is Dr. Julia Creet. And her film is entitled Data Mining the Deceased. So her film is tomorrow afternoon, and I've seen it. I can attest to the high quality of the film, and I think you'll all enjoy it. So please tell your friends and family to come out, because it's a really interesting and revealing film. And without further ado, I should mention that the Department of History at Lakehead University is proud to sponsor this session. So thank you very much for coming out. And if you haven't been to the festival, we've got films all afternoon and all day tomorrow, and this evening and tomorrow evening as well. So thank you very much, Julia, for coming up.
Hello, everyone. I think what I'll do first is I'll show you the trailer for the documentary, which will be on tomorrow. It's been broadcast on TVO now, I think half a dozen times, and it's streaming on the TVO website for another week. They stream it for about a month after each broadcast. So it's been up and down, available all this year since February. February was the broadcast premiere. After you see the trailer, I'll tell you a bit about how I came to this project. And I've just finished writing a book, which was initially titled The Genealogy of Genealogy, and now, you know, the way books work, they often shift as you're writing them. So now I think it's going to be called The Great DNA Giveaway, Ancestry and the Business of Family. So that gives you a sense of where I've come to with this project. But I've done a great deal of research. I've been involved in researching family history, my own and the industry now, for probably 20 years. So I might tell you some things about the industry that you didn't know or that you don't want to know. But I think the issues of privacy and genealogical information are very much coming to the fore now, particularly with this kind of harvesting of DNA. So I'll show you the trailer. This is the TVO trailer. And then I'll talk to you about my research, and I will take any questions that you might have. And I assume that you have an interest in genealogy. You probably wouldn't be here. So we can have, I'll talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then we can have a pretty far-ranging discussion. So if you wouldn't mind hitting the lights.
Is the business of family history truly about family?
Family Search in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does what it does respective to family history, because doctrinally we truly believe that these precious relationships, they're not going to end at death.
Data Mining the Deceased, Ancestry and the Business of Family, February 1st on TVO. Questions that reveal new perspectives.
All right, so that was the TVO trailer. I'll show you one more trailer. I'll show you the trailer that I did for the doc, which is essentially the first 3 minutes.
There's something in all of us, some innate need to know who we are and why we are who we are. And that leads you immediately to start looking into your past.
It's about selling relationships, and it's about making money out of the ways in which people are related to one another.
We are using genetic tools to make trans-historical truth claims about ancestry and about human history.
My journey into family history began in the mid-1990s, when I was driven to discover the details of a family's secret. By the mid-2000s, after a decade of digging, I realized that this sojourn back into my own past could go on forever. And in that short time, genealogy had become an accelerating online industry and the existential stuff of reality TV. But what does knowing your ancestors really tell you about who you are? And was my enthusiasm for family history truly my own? Is the business of family history really about family? Or are we essentially data mining the deceased?
Plates, please. Thank you. So let me tell you a bit about how I came to start researching the industry. And, you know, give you a sense of my perspective about it as well. I spent the better part of a decade trying to put together a family history, my mother's story, because I grew up without any family history whatsoever. Both my parents were immigrants to Canada, and they were from Europe, and their philosophy was, we've left Europe, we can leave the past behind. And I think that's often true of people who have come from traumatic histories, that immigration is a way of really making a clean break between the present and the past. And so I grew up Canadian, that's just, you know, that's all there was to it. And then shortly before my mother died, my sister revealed this family secret, that she in fact had been Jewish. And I was 26 by then, and I thought, no, that seems like a complete fabrication. How can that be true? There's been no talk about it at all. There's been no discussion in the family. This makes absolutely no sense to me at all. But my mother was quite sick by then, and it wasn't one of those things that we could talk to her about. And so I never had a conversation with her about it. But then after she died, things started to surface, and she had been quite a prolific writer. She'd written poetry, she'd written a lot of book reviews, she was writing for the Whig Standard in Kingston. She'd done a ton of photojournalistic profiles of other people. She was a professional portrait photographer, very talented woman. But the one person that she had never really talked about was herself. Although she had written these manuscripts and she had tried to publish them, but she tried to publish them as fiction, when in fact they were much, much, much closer to memoir. So she'd written about her life, but she'd left out all the details. She left out the most important parts of her story. And yet she felt compelled to write about her life. Anyway, after she died, I started going through her papers, and my father would have thrown everything out, but we managed to stop him from doing that. And I decided that I would go to Hungary. It took me a long time down that path, and I know that those of you who do family history, these things, these stories take a very long time to develop. So about 10 years after I started to piece the story together, I thought, okay, I'm gonna go to Hungary and see what I can find. Now I don't speak Hungarian, and all of the primary documents were in Hungarian, and it was a long shot to find anything. But in fact, I found all of my grandfather's papers, all of her father's papers in an archive in Székesfehérvár, which is about 70 miles from Hungary. So at that point, I had her opaque memoirs and his unreadable archive, and I was sunk. And so I spent the next 10 years of my research life really trying to put this story back together, with long periods of time in Hungary. I had 2 research leaves in Hungary. And I learned enough Hungarian to, not get my hands chopped off at the butcher. But that is a very difficult language. And so I would have to, working with primary documents, figure out what a document did. What was its function before I could really decide whether it was worth translating or not. At any rate, I managed to piece the story together, and of course it was a terribly, terribly tragic story. The family had been Jewish, they'd all been deported. She'd lost her entire family, she'd lost her first child, and her solution to survival was essentially to forget that entire history. And she converted. She became a member of the United Church in Kingston, and so we were brought up Protestant. At the end of that period, so I started that research in about the mid-1990s, and I finished the bulk of it by about the early 2000s. I made a documentary. My first documentary is about her story. It's available online. It's called MUM, M-U-M, Story of Silence. And I was bitten by two bugs at the same time, the genealogy bug and the documentary bug. So they've really gone hand in hand for me. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's the way it's worked. At the end of my primary research, I kind of looked around and I thought, well, everybody's doing this. There were all kinds of Jewish genealogists in Eastern Europe collecting records, sending them back to the Mormon Archive, sending them back to Jewish Gen in New York. And I just kept running into more and more and more and more people who were doing this. And I thought, okay, so I'm not alone. You know, I thought my story was very special, but clearly I'm not alone. And why, what's happening? What's the environment? What's the context that's driving this interest? And then, you know, these passive inquiry are never quite straightforward. Then I read a story by Daniel Kish, who was a Yugoslav writer. And he wrote a story, also, you know, his father had also perished. He wrote a story called the Encyclopedia of the Dead. And it was a story about an archive in Sweden that was in the caverns of the Swedish National Library. And the story is that this woman who has just lost her father has gone to Sweden to visit a friend, and a friend says, you know, I'm going to take you to this archive. So she goes into the archive after hours, and she's led down into the cavern, and there she finds, and she realizes that it's the Encyclopedia of the Dead. It's the story of everyone who has ever lived, written by an anonymous group of historians, these kind of recording angels. And she's fascinated. She finds her father's entry, and she's completely fascinated by what she finds there. All of the details, scenes from his childhood. And then she finds a little bit too much information. As some of us, I think, have had that experience of going, did I really need to know that about that family member? And she finds out her father had died of cancer. She figures out that he had been drawing all these floral pictures, and in fact what he had been drawing were the shapes of his own cancer. And then she wakes up and realizes, oh, this was all a dream. But it's really written as a Gothic nightmare. How, you know, what would it be like if every moment of our existence were recorded by people we didn't know? And then Daniel Kish, after he publishes the story, it's published in the New Yorker for the first time, and then he republishes it in this collection of short stories, and he adds a footnote at the end. And the footnote says, when I published this story, I didn't realize that this imaginary archive that I had created actually exists. And it exists in Salt Lake City, in the caverns of the Granite Mountain Vault. And I read that story, and I read that footnote, and I thought, oh my goodness, what's going on? Why are the Mormons collecting this information? What's their story about? And then once I started to think about the Mormons, I started to think about Ancestry, and once I started to think about databases, well, that's what took me off on this journey. So for the last 7 years, I've been researching the industry itself. Who's collecting the information? Why are they collecting it? And what are the end uses? What are they going to do with it in the end? I finished this documentary last year, and then just after I finished this documentary, a publisher in the States, the University of Massachusetts Press, asked me to review a manuscript, and then they said, "Oh, we see that you're working on this book." And I was like, "Yeah, whatever." I put the book on the back burner. And they said, we'd really like to see some of it. So lo and behold, within 2 days I had a contract for the book, and that threw me back into the research process. So I've just finished drafting that book, and I spent a lot more time researching the economics of the databases and where the information is ultimately going. So the doc was really the data mining of the deceased. It was the first phase of the research, and the book, I think now called The Great DNA Giveaway, was the second phase of the research. But it built on the research that I did for the documentary. So I could tell you a great deal about the industry now. The history of the databases, why they developed, the economics of the databases, which is crucial because they are huge. They're some of the biggest databases in the world. The Mormon Database now contains 33 times the number of records as the Library of Congress in the U.S. That is one of the most expansive databases in the world. It's up there with Google. 23andMe, I don't know if you know 23andMe, that's a Google-owned company. And Ancestry.com was started by Mormons by LDS church members for other LDS church members. But now, of course, it's the biggest commercial database in the world. Both Ancestry and the LDS database the headquarters of those two databases are now within 5 miles of each other. They're both in Utah. They're just outside Salt Lake City. So the major data collection enterprise is very much part of the larger LDS project. Now, you may or may not know this, and you may or may not care. That's one part of the industry, and I think the LDS Church is absolutely. In fact, the founders of Ancestry, Dan Taggart, who was the first fellow you saw in the trailer, said that there wouldn't have been an industry without the LDS Church. So we tend to think that our motivations are purely our own, but in fact we've been motivated by a much larger zeitgeist, by a much larger cultural movement that is in the first instance really promoted by the LDS Church for their own purposes. Now, that's not to say that genealogical research started with the LDS Church, because it certainly didn't. But in America, they've been, in the United States, in North America, they've been really the prime motivators. Let's put it that way. So the LDS is a non-profit organization, but it is, the church puts the greatest percentage of the church's resources go towards the genealogical database. So you think about how big the Mormon Church and the vastness of their resources, that's their primary enterprise at the moment. And it's a very, very rich church. Ancestry and the Mormon Church are working together. The financial arrangements of those are, you can't access the financial details of those arrangements. But I say more about that in the documentary, and I've learned a great deal more about that myself. And 23andMe, of course, is a privately owned company, and it has two arms. It has in fact, almost all genealogy companies now have a DNA testing service as well as a records access service. 23andMe was set up a bit differently. It was set up as a ancestral DNA testing service and a medical, medical history or a genetic genealogy, a genetic medical history testing service as well. So the industry is now heavily involved in what's called recreational genomics. And recreational genomics is one of the least regulated forms of genetic genetic gathering, information gathering. And it's the most personal because you are giving your DNA away, essentially. So what I found out, all right, have I scared you yet? Not yet? You don't care. My primary concern these days is around the privacy of genealogical information. And my research has been funded by the federal funding bodies for for scholarly research. But it's also been funded by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, because the Privacy Commissioner is also very, very interested in these questions of genetic privacy and personal information privacy. And the Privacy Commissioner has some real concerns about the circulation of DNA information as well. So they are funding, they're also funding my ongoing research, and I'm just actually in the process of applying to them for further funding to try and mount a public awareness campaign about how the DNA is being used. The short story is that all of the DNA databases are being sold to the pharmaceutical industry. When you send in your DNA sample to one of the genetic genealogy companies, whether it's Ancestry or 23andMe or Sorensen, I don't know if any of you contributed to the Sorensen database when it was first set up. And many of these databases were actually, some of the databases were set up as nonprofit at the beginning, but they too have been sold. Sorensen Genetics was the original database that was sold to Ancestry. It too was started in Utah. So when you sign those waivers that you have to sign in order to submit your DNA sample, can I just ask how many people have submitted DNA samples? Okay, so when you did that, you signed a terms of agreement. In that terms of agreement, you gave, and may I ask who you did it with?
Ancestry.
With Ancestry. So you gave Ancestry complete proprietary rights. Now that means that they can do whatever research they want on it. They can sell it to whoever they like. If you want to see how Ancestry is reconfiguring, and this is worth having a look at, so I'll just show you this briefly. It's all public information. None of this is really, it's not hidden. It's just that people don't really think to look for it. And if I sound like a bit of a crusader, Ancestry has, I think, the most efficient or one of the most motivating advertising campaigns in the industry. They have a superb advertising campaign. Now, the irony of, and I'll dig a little further into the database in a moment, or into their site, but discover what makes you uniquely you. Think about that for a second. That the industry, and this is the idea that I developed in the book, that the industry is predicated on the idea that we don't know who we are. Who do you think you are? Right? That's the entire industry is predicated on that question. That we, as we are moving through the world in our daily life, living with our families, doing our work, living in our community, we don't know who we are. Really? We don't we? Do we really need to buy information? And you know, I mean, I'm very sensitive to these issues, obviously, which is why I told you how I came to my to this. Is that me? No. Okay. How I came to study the industry. So I do understand that those questions can feel very, very pressing. But that's not how the industry sells it. The industry sells it. The main message of the industry is that we lack knowledge about ourselves. Now, we've never really lacked all that much information about ourselves prior to the last 20 years. Think about it. We knew who we were, didn't we? Sort of. You knew who you were, your parents told you who you were, or your grandparents, you might have known your grandparents. That was kind of enough. But now we need to know who we are back to the 17th, 18th century. We need our bloodlines back to, 10,000 years. It's not information we've ever needed before. And so the industry has created a new lack for us. And it's really that we don't know something essential about who we are. I think that's pernicious. I really do. And here's the irony, is that as the databases get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, we become smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller parts of those databases. So there's an inverse proportion of our importance to the database and the database's kind of reach. But that's, of course, they would never sell that by saying to you, well, everybody's doing this, and you are an insignificant part of our database. No, instead you're going to find yourself. You're going to find out who you really are in the database. So here's what's going on. So that's the front of the industry. What's going on behind the industry? Unlock the family story in your DNA. Well, it's not the family story. It's the story of the entire world. We are all mongrels. So they like to use the tagline, everyone is related. But at the same time, they're telling you we're each of us is unique. Well, we're not that unique. We share 99.9% of our DNA. So the bits of DNA that are different are exceptionally minute. And in fact, we're much more similar than we are different. But that would never sell, even though everyone's related sells. Telling you you're the same as everyone else wouldn't work in the industry. So we have to be given the sense that we will learn something about us that's uniquely about us. And it certainly feels that way, and I really do understand that. But if you, holy crow, I'm related to George Washington, yeah, well, probably 25% of the US is related to George Washington. That doesn't make you special. That makes you, in fact, part of a very, very large group. Just a sidebar, one of the chapters, well, it's not a sidebar, but as an illustration, one of the chapters in the book, in fact, I start the book with the story of Confucius. And because Confucius has the oldest genealogy in the world. And it runs to 183, it's probably up to 185 by now, consecutive generations. They have kept a written genealogical record. Now, this is father to son only. Women somehow don't matter in lineage. Certainly not in the lineage of Confucius. I'm not quite sure how all those sons were produced, but the women were part of it. So during the Cultural Revolution, Mao declared that Confucius was, in fact, a stinking corpse, and there shouldn't be any attention paid to him. and the genealogy, Confucius's genealogy, kind of went underground. But it was revived in the late 1990s because China realized, as it was moving towards capitalism, and this is, again, you have to think of the larger context of why these databases come to life. China realized that it had lost its kind of the moral compass in a way, and it had lost a certain public relations exercise worldwide, and so it decided to start up these institutes called the Confucius Institutes, and the institutes were offered to universities around the world. As part of that, they revived Confucius's genealogy, and they decided to update the genealogy. And so the first time in 2,500 years, women were allowed to register, and Chinese who didn't live on mainland China, so Taiwanese, were allowed to register as well. All of a sudden, the members of this genealogy went from, his family went from about 680,000 to over 3 million. Because the idea was that if you could claim a relationship to Confucius, that was an honor, and it would lead to kind of better morals and better behavior. Now, what does it mean to be part of a family of 3 million people? Does that give you something special? Now, interestingly enough, they decided that they didn't want to test people's DNA because they recognized that it was a cultural phenomenon that they were after, that it was identification that they were after, and that if the DNA didn't bear it out, that people would be disappointed, or they would begin to question the bloodlines, and they didn't want the genealogy questioned, so they didn't do the DNA testing. So there's an example of people who were, who wanted to be both unique, who felt that belonging to that bloodline gave them something unique, and yet they were part of a very, very large group of people who called themselves Confucius family. One of the Chinese dailies quipped that, he's been dead 2,500 years, and yet his family just keeps growing. Okay, so if we go into down here into corporate information. Okay, that all looks let's see if it's here in the newsroom. Okay, so Tim Sullivan was the CEO, was the CEO of PayPal. So he's stepping down. That's interesting. You can see that they're all involved in the big, large, in the huge information tech companies. But now, where's what I wanted to show you? Let's just wonder if it's in here. Those are all the brands, those are all that's not what I'm after. Oh, maybe it's under our story. We're a science and technology company with a very human mission. Okay, so they are calling themselves now not a genealogy company, but a science and technology company. And the reason they're calling themselves that is because they're selling the databases to the pharmaceutical industry. So and that's who they're reporting their results to as well. So on the front side of it, you see that it's all about you and it's all about family. On the back side, you see the technology part of it and who they think they are. So if you ask Ancestry, who do you think you are, that's their answer. We're a science and technology company. I'll tell you, how much time do I have? Have I yammered on? Yes, I've yammered on long enough. You get my kind of drift. So, questions? I have lots more to tell you, but questions, comments, concerns?
So what's the sinister side of selling information?
Well, it's a good question. In a way we don't know, and in a way we do know. We know that historically, genetics and genealogical information have been used for eugenics purposes. The contemporary concerns tend to be about health insurance. Will these companies sell your information to the health companies? Will you have to reveal that you've done these tests to your insurance company? There's a lot of concern about that. The data is anonymized, but not really, because it's all linked with the genealogy information. And so that's the really valuable part of these databases. It's not just the DNA, it's that the DNA is linked with the genealogies, which means that they can use the information. It's not just your information that you're giving them. You're giving them the information of your entire family. Because once they have that DNA sample and they have the genealogical information, they can then apportion DNA to, to your various relations. So your kids are going to have half your DNA, you're going to have half of your parents' DNA, a quarter of your grandparents' DNA, and so on. So they can build these DNA pictures out of one DNA sample. They can expand that dramatically. We don't know what happens to private information, but you know that as soon as you do a search on Ancestry, every ad you get is for some kind of Ancestry service. So, of course, there's that part of the information problem as well. But let me tell you the example of Iceland, because the other case study. So I do three sort of, I examine three databases in the documentary. The Mormon Database, the Ancestry Database, and the case of Iceland's Decode Genetics. So Decode Genetics was a startup genetics research company. Started in the early 2000s, and their idea, and it was an excellent idea. The guy who started it, Kari Stephenson, was a neuroscientist from Harvard, and he thought, if I go home to Iceland, he was originally from Iceland, if I go back to Iceland, I have a perfect laboratory in the population of Iceland, because I have a homogeneous population with extraordinary genealogy records, the best in the world, some of the best in the world. And I can start an industry there. I can bring something home. I will have much more latitude to work in Iceland than I do in a university lab where I'm constrained by all kinds of ethics protocols and privacy protocols. So he went home to Iceland. He started at Decode Genetics. And the first thing he did was, there was a fellow, again, you'll see this all tomorrow, but there was a fellow, Friedrich Skúlason, who was, he was an amateur genealogist, but he was also a tech guy. He was a tech guy who worked in privacy, ironically. And he had started a genealogy database. And he was slowly working his, slowly collecting records. And they have, in the sagas, they have genealogical records that go back to the 9th century. It's an extraordinarily rich. And it's a very small population. It still only has 300,000 people. So Kari Stephenson went to Skúlason and he said, look, we need this database. How long is it going to take you? And Schooler said, well, it's taking 40 years. And they said, no, we need it now. So they paid for the Decode paid to have Schoolerson create a genealogical database of the entire country, going back as far as possibly could. And then Decode applied to the government of Iceland for a license to the medical records of the entire country. And they got that license. And then there was a huge privacy storm about access to those medical records, because it was a nationalized medical system, and the records were very good. And Decode was a private company, and nobody else had access to the records, only Decode. And then Decode asked for people to volunteer their DNA, or doctors to volunteer their patients' DNA. And they got about 120,000 samples. And then they took the DNA, the medical records that eventually they lost the license, but they got all kinds of medical records from doctors and people who were willing to give it to them along with their DNA. So they took the DNA, the medical records, and the genealogy, and they wove them all together in the interests of medical research in order to track the some of the most debilitating inherited diseases. That sounds like a fantastic idea, right? That sounds like a really profitable idea. Well, and they were funded by La Roche, and they promised that any drugs that were developed would be given back to the population of Iceland. Instead of which, no drugs have been developed. Iceland has received nothing except for, yes, they started a homemade industry, and so they gave Icelanders, a number of Icelanders, very good jobs. It went bankrupt in 2008. The entire database was sold to Amgen, which is an American pharmaceutical company. And now it's been sold off again. The records are still in Iceland, but now several pharmaceutical companies have access to those records. So there were huge, this became in the late 1990s, early 2000s, this became a hugely controversial issue, because in essence they had turned Iceland into a captive biomedical community. Now we're doing much the same thing with ourselves when we give both our genealogical information and our genetic information to these databases. We are voluntarily making ourselves into a biomedical community. We don't know what the consequences of that will be down the line, but I think that the Iceland example is clear that that information can be bought and sold at will once you've contributed it. And that, I think, should sort of concern us. But yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it seems entirely benign. What could possibly go wrong?
In the Canadian context, well, if I was an American, I'd have grave concerns, because my availability of insurance would be highly dependent on the information that they have. They would say yes or no, depending on what they found out through that search. In Canada, the context is a little bit different, isn't it?
Yes.
You just show your health card and you get coverage regardless of what your ancestry is.
True enough. But many of us have private coverage as well, right?
True enough.
And those companies, you know, they might go very much, we don't know where the Canadian health system is going. And the thing is, again, it's not just your information, but it's your children as well. Right? So it reverberates generationally, and it, yeah.
So if you're working with the Privacy Commissioner,
yeah,
I really hope that that point is taken, that there is a sinister side, that we don't want to follow the American lead.
The Privacy Commissioner, one of the top priorities of the Privacy Commissioner right now is bioinformation. And it's very much linked to that, to health records and the insurance industry. Yeah, the Privacy Commissioner is really, they're beginning to recognize that that the recreational genomics or direct consumer genetics is a pretty it's a pretty iffy proposition in terms of privacy and ownership of information.
So here's a question. If I was Ronald McDonald